So at that conference of reunion in 1939, there were central jurisdictions set up so that any African American churches would be part of their own jurisdiction and would not be part of the annual conferences and jurisdictions of the white churches, even in the North. So we had the Methodist Church reunited in 1939, but we were racially segregated. Along the way, especially as the 20th century went on, there were annual conferences, Illinois, for example, who on their own abolished the central jurisdiction among them and integrated their annual conference. Eventually, the general conference of the church also desegregated. So there was a moment in 1968 when the Methodist Church dissolved the central jurisdictions and also united with the Evangelical United Brethren denomination. And that's when we became the United Methodist Church in 1968. They had a called general conference, a special called general conference in 1970 in St. Louis to finish working out the details of that reunion. But we have continued as a denomination to work through that sin of segregation in our past. And I have a memory of after I joined the annual conference in 1996, I think it was the year 2000, when we had across annual conferences acts of repentance and confession for the racism of our past. So we had a speaker at this conference who sort of walked us through that past. His name is Junius Dawson. He is the General Secretary of Discipleship Ministries and lives right here in Nashville. We also spent a little bit of time talking about the history of women in the church and how there were women ordained in the Methodist movement as early as the 19th century, but it was not, women were not given full clergy rights until 1956, at a general conference in 1956. And we continue to deal with sexism in the church, churches that say we don't want a woman pastor, or we had a woman pastor last time, we've paid our dues, things like that. So all of these things are still present in the church, but we're working on that, and we need to be mindful of these things. So just to catch us all up on our recent past, I found it interesting that in 1970 we completed the work of uniting the church and removing at least the structure and the language of racism in our church. Let me ask real quick, are there any open seats out there? We have some people standing. Just raise your hand if you've got an open seat. Anybody who wants to join in. If you're like me, sometimes it feels better to stand, but we've got seats. Raise your hand if you would, so people can find their way. Great. So we reunited as a denomination in 1970, removed the structures of the language in our discipline and the structures of segregation. And then 2 years later, in 1972, at the General Conference, the language around homosexuality as being incompatible with Christian teaching entered the Book of Discipline. So we had 2 years in between those two things. Since then, we have continued as a general conference, which meets every 4 years and is a legislative voting body of representatives from the global church, have continued to struggle over the exclusion of LGBTQ folks in our church and marriage rights and ordination rights among us. And that has gone, I was going to say back and forth, but not really back and forth. It's just moved to continue with the language that does not allow marriage or ordination. We got to General Conference 2016, and I think most of you know this story, so I'm just going to zing on through it, as painful as it is. But because the denomination was at such an impasse, the General Conference asked the Council of Bishops to help us find a way out of the legislative gridlock that we've been in. And so they created the commission on the way forward, a group of people representing the global church, representing various contexts and perspectives on inclusion, and they worked together, prayed together, listened to one another for 2 years, came to a called general conference in 2019 of this year with primarily one plan, the one church plan, that would allow congregations, pastors, and annual conferences to determine for themselves about weddings and about ordination of our friends who identify as LGBTQ. In that legislative gathering, the votes went an entirely different way. There was a traditionalist plan that was put forward, which would continue the language that we currently have in the Book of Discipline and increase the consequences and punishments for those who break the discipline. Those petitions take effect January 1st of 2020. We went over those at a town hall meeting after February, so I encourage you to go back to that video if you need a reminder of what was included in that. It does include greater consequences for pastors who break the discipline. There was a petition passed at General Conference in 2019 for disaffiliation. So if there were congregations who wanted to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church, there was a path to do that. However, since then, the Judicial Council has ruled that unconstitutional. So at this point, there is not a path for churches to do that. So after General Conference, how did West End respond? I'm just going to hold this so I don't have to go back and forth. One of the first things we did was to hold a service of lament, an opportunity for those in our congregation who were harmed and hurt and disappointed in the actions of the General Conference to gather for prayer and to offer our grief to God. The ministry table had some discussion about how we could proclaim who we are as West End in this particular moment in our denomination. And so we discussed and voted to redo our banners in a way that would highlight our welcome statement, the welcome statement that's printed on the website and in the bulletin that this congregation had already embraced and embodied. And so you may have seen our banners redone in a way that would allow our LGBT neighbors to know that this is a safe place. This is an affirming and loving place for everybody. The ministry table voted to take part in an opportunity with other United Methodist churches in our area. There was a grant actually given by United Methodist Communications for this to put an ad in the Pride magazine that came out during the Pride Festival to say, you're welcome here. And we are hurting and apologize for what happened in February, and we want you to know that you're loved. The ministry table and pastors and leaders continued in a season of listening and discernment, creating space for conversation, because in this moment we want to hear one another. We have lots of different perspectives among us, and we want to continue as one, listening and loving one another. So we've been intentional about that. And our Way Forward team, which prior to the February General Conference had been tasked with creating space for conversation, many in that group wanted to continue in more of an advocacy role. And so their role has sort of shifted so that they are really the ones on our behalf paying close attention to the latest news in our denomination and praying about and looking toward ways that we can continue to be who we are as West End. Real quickly, after February, there are also, and before February happened also, there are groups within the denomination advocating and working for different things. And I just want to, so you'll have the vocabulary to know who some of these groups are. After February, Tom Lee and I went to Kansas City to a gathering that was sponsored by a group that's now calling themselves UMC Next, geared This was also convened by the Church of the Resurrection, and the convening team was made up of a diverse group of folks. Called meeting for those who were not happy with what happened in February, and want to find a way forward, with including a church of different perspectives, that we want to move forward together, but we don't want to move forward in that way that the traditionalist plan has laid out. So that group is working, and you'll hear more from Davis about their plan proposed for General Conference coming up. Mainstream USA, UMC is another group that is working for change among centrists and progressive congregations. The Forward is a group that's primarily led by people of color and people who identify as LGBTQ, and they're calling their movement more a liberation movement. It's time for the church to be liberated from all of this exclusive language, and they have also put forward a plan. You may also have heard the name Wesley Covenant Association. That group is a group more of traditionalists, and or primarily the group that led the way in getting the traditionalist plan passed in February. And so they are very organized and also taking part in some conversations that are happening right now. Whew. So that is what has gotten us to this point. I'm going to now turn it over to Davis Turner, who is going to walk us through what some of the proposals are for the next General Conference. So we have General Conference every 4 years, so we have our regular General Conference in 2020. And there are all sorts of things that this legislation is about, not just this particular question. But Davis is going to walk us through what some of these proposals are.
Good morning. As Carol said, I'm Davis Turner, and I was honored and blessed to go with Carol and Erin to the Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City to meet with leaders from 1,300 other churches, mostly centrists and progressives. There were some traditionals as well, to learn about the proposals that have come before the General Conference in 2020 regarding LGBTQ inclusion. Now, I'll use the terms, and Carol used the terms traditional, centrist, progressive, because those were the terms being used at the conference, and in the plans I'll discuss briefly in a moment. But I realize, and everyone at the conference realizes, that churches are usually made up of a combination of members who consider themselves traditional, centrist, progressive, just as West End is. And there may be members who consider themselves traditional in some areas and progressive in others. But that's just the problem with labels, and so I hope you'll excuse me for using those labels today. The United Methodist Church is unified in its desire to share Christ with others, to bless the poor and marginalized, and serve our communities. But we are currently at an impasse over controversies about United Methodist social teachings concerning LGBTQ inclusion and church governance. It appears that we are unable for now to walk the same path forward. Of course, we are not the first denomination to go down this path. The Lutheran, Presbyterian, and most recently the Episcopal denominations have all gone before us. One of the speakers at the conference from UMC Next mentioned advice he received from an Episcopal colleague who told him, "You will discover that you either need to walk together more loosely or part with a blessing." The feeling seems to be, at least at this conference that we attended, that the United Methodist Church tried to walk more loosely at the General Conference earlier this year. So maybe it is time to come now to part with a blessing. And he stressed how important it is that if we part, that we part with a blessing. UMC Next sees separation as a faithful step to those who experience God's calling to move in different directions. The witness of the Bible demonstrates that God can use separation of ministry partners like Paul, Barnabas, and Mark to reach more people as the good news is shared in different ways. September 18th, just prior to the conference, was the deadline to submit petitions for the 2020 General Conference. I understand there were many proposals submitted on the issue of full inclusion. However, at the conference in Kansas City, we only heard about two plans in any kind of detail, the Indianapolis plan and the UMC Next plan. Now, the Indianapolis plan was created by a group of traditionalists, centrists, and progressives at a meeting in Indianapolis, hence the name. So it was a negotiated plan with no one group getting everything they wanted and some issues being left totally unaddressed. The plan was summarized at the conference by the Reverend Dr. John Stevens, who's a senior pastor of Chapelwood United Methodist Church in Houston. The full text of the plan can be found on his blog at embodygrace.org. The plan provides a pathway for the development of a traditionalist United Methodist Church and a centrist United Methodist Church. A progressive expression may emerge as a progressive United Methodist Church or may be included in the centrist United Methodist Church. Now, the names Traditionalist United Methodist Church, Centrist United Methodist Church, Progressive United Methodist Church, those are only placeholders, and each new denomination will choose their own name, and they can use the term United Methodist Church as part of their name, if they so choose. The United Methodist Church would not be dissolved, but would continue its legally it would continue as through the centrist United Methodist Church. Annual conferences in the United States would decide by a simple majority vote which denomination to join. Annual conferences not making a decision would become part of the centrist United Methodist Church. Local churches disagreeing with their annual conference's decision could decide by a simple majority vote to align with a different denomination. And clergy and bishops would decide with which denomination to align. Any annual conference, local churches or clergy choosing to align with a denomination other than the traditional United Methodist Church would be exempt following the adjournment of the 2020 General Conference from the restrictive provisions of the discipline related to marriage and ordination. WestPath, which was formerly the General Board of Pension and Health Benefits, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, the United Methodist Women, the General Commission on United Methodist Men, and the United Methodist Publishing House would continue as independent 501c3 organizations with their own self-perpetuating boards and would be able to serve any denomination that desires to receive services from them. All other United Methodist boards and agencies would become part of the centrist United Methodist Church. Outside the U.S., annual conferences are organized into 7 central conferences. So central conferences, annual conferences, and local churches outside of the United States would decide by simple majority vote which denomination to join. If they do not vote by March 31st of 2021, they become part of the traditionalist United Methodist Church by default. Central conferences would be supported by all the denominations in the 2021 to 2024 UMC budget. A process for allocating general church assets to fund transition to new denominations would be adopted by the 2020 General Conference. A process for allocating the general church assets is not something the parties could agree upon in Indianapolis. Now, Reverend Stevens indicated that the intention was to create a starting point if separation is the will of the General Conference. All petitions are assigned to different legislative committees, and the Indianapolis group understands that the General Conference delegates will change portions of their plan. They also understand the Judicial Council will need to rule on items, and the plan may require some changes. Then the Reverend Tom Berlin spoke about the UMC Next plan. Reverend Berlin is the lead pastor at Florist United Methodist Church in Herndon, Virginia. UMC Next is one of the sponsors of the gathering in Kansas City, as Carol said. Reverend Berlin gave a shout out to Austin Atkinson, who is United Methodist pastor in Seattle, for his work on the plan. And Austin is, more importantly, the son of Tom and Lois Atkinson, and grew up here at West End. Another connection to West End is the Reverend Katie Dawson, a pastor from Des Moines, Iowa. Reverend Dawson is on the convening team of UMC Next, and she graduated from Vanderbilt Divinity School and was a former intern here at West End, if some of you recall. The UMC Next plan is broken into 23 separate petitions. And among other things, this plan calls for an immediate moratorium on charges against LGBTQ clergy performing same-sex weddings, or other charges stemming from the provisions of the traditional plan. It also calls for a repeal of the traditional plan and other incompatibility language from the Book of Discipline. There's a process to depart from the United Methodist Church for local churches who vote with a 2/3 majority. Local churches can join a new Wesleyan expression of the church. Those churches that do not desire to make this decision will remain in the United Methodist Church. Reverend Berlin stated that UMC Next was focused on the constitutionality of its provisions. They didn't want to put a great deal of work into a plan that would later be ruled unconstitutional, as has happened in the past. The implication was that he thought parts of the Indianapolis plan would not be held constitutional. Now, UMC Next believes there's consensus at the 2020 General Conference to pass disaffiliation provisions allowing churches to leave and form new Wesleyan movements. However, they do not believe they will have the votes at the 2020 General Conference to make all the changes needed until churches have actually left the United Methodist Church. So UMC Next sees the following as the most likely way forward. At the May 2020 General Conference, they would like to pass a moratorium on charges, complaints, and trials, pass legislation to allow local churches the ability to leave the United Methodist Church and enter a new life in a new Wesleyan denomination. Viable denominations formed by the United Methodist congregation that are new expressions of the Wesleyan movement will be allocated resources determined by a resource allocation formula, again, that's yet to be determined. They want to create a commission on the 21st century church to prepare a comprehensive proposal for a structure and governance plan that addresses historic inequities and injustice that Carol went over, and includes clarification to the adaptability of the Book of Discipline. And they want to call a special session of the General Conference in 2023 that would serve as a constitutional convention. The purpose of the meeting is to ensure that the United Methodist Church takes the next faithful step to create a new structure of the church according to a renewed, resurrected mission, vision, and values, or as they described it, to reboot the church. Then at the called meeting in 2023, they would like to see all language, the removal of all language in the Book of Discipline used to restrict pastors and churches from conducting same-sex weddings and restricting annual conferences from licensing or ordaining LGBTQ persons. They'd like to see legislation passed that's currently proposed to create a U.S. regional conference, and they want to create a Book of Discipline with adaptable proportions for different regions of the world. Again, the belief is that there is general consensus now regarding passing a proposal to allow churches to leave and form new expressions of Methodism in 2020. There are currently 35,000, give or take, United Methodist congregations, and the Reverend Adam Hamilton, who's a senior pastor at Church of the Resurrection and a member of the convening team, believes that the United Methodist Church will lose 3,500 to 7,000 traditional churches if a proposal passes that allows them to leave. He also estimates he'll lose another group of progressive churches that are not willing to wait until 2023 for all these changes to occur. Then the belief is, after these departures, they'll be able to remove all the language from the Book of Discipline that currently does not permit full inclusion of LGBTQ persons at the specially called conference in 2023. There is one more plan that was briefly mentioned at the conference, a plan put forth by WEUMC. Unlike the other plans, the WEUMC plan dissolves the United Methodist Church and creates 4 new global denominations: traditional, moderate, progressive, as well as a libertarian Methodist Church. Liberation, I'm sorry. Not libertarian. Liberation. They would not be, those of course still would not be the actual names of the denominations, they're merely placeholders once again. And the plan for separation would then be submitted to a special conference before 2024. Now, these 3 plans are not the only plans that have been submitted, and there's still a lot of uncertainty. We are on a path that we do not know for sure where it will lead. This will not be easy. It is hard work, and we are not in control. We are in the wilderness now, but the good news is that we are not alone. God is with us just as surely as he was with the Israelites when they left Egypt for the Promised Land. But we need to remember, as both the prophet Isaiah and John in Revelations tells us, that God is making all things new. Now I'll turn it back over to Carol to close this out.
Thank you, Davis. That put clearly and succinctly what we heard at the conference and what has been hard for many of us to wrap our brains around. So thank you. And again, this video will be available on our website, and I'll try to get a link to these slides as well, perhaps in my Monday meditation, so you can take a little bit more time over them. I wanted to just wrap us up with a little bit of a reflection. This is a really difficult and painful moment in the church, unlike any I've ever seen. It's a moment of crisis. And I want to invite us all to offer grace to ourselves and to each other. I think one of the things I've heard in conversations with so many of you, including our LGBTQ members, is we're weary of the conversation. And what has happened in our denomination has forced this upon us. Our book of discipline is at odds with our welcome statement, and it's hard for us to know how to navigate these waters. And I'm looking for easy answers, and there are none. So as Davis said, it's hard work, and it takes patience. And in some ways, I'd like to figure out how we can pass the baton back and forth to one another. Davis and I and Erin were able to go to Kansas City. Our Way Forward team is doing hard work, and sometimes they're going to need rest, we're going to need rest, our leaders are going to need rest. And so we need one another to step up and say, I'll take this piece of it, or I'll continue with the baton for a little while and pass it on while you rest. So I want to invite us to have patience with each other and in this moment. I thought of the image of the disciples in the boat with the storm, and they were so afraid, and Jesus was asleep. And Peter wakes Jesus up and says, "Don't you care that we're perishing?" And that's how I feel sometimes. God, where are you? The church is just grinding away at itself, and don't you care that we're perishing? And I so appreciate Davis's word, and it lifts up moments that I've had along this journey where I hear God saying, I am with you. I've got this. Walk with me. And I think we need to be reminded that God is with us, and we're not alone on this journey. We are called to be who we're called to be, and to continue moving forward as we're called to, and to take care of one another in the process. Part of what makes up this perfect storm is the way our global church is structured. We have a convention every 4 years with 800 people from across the globe who don't know each other, called to majority rule. And that has led to power struggles. Sorry? Say again? Oh, yes, 1,000 delegates. But people who don't know each other from across the world called for 2 weeks to make these great decisions on our behalf. And we have delegates from, as we know, across the globe coming from different contexts. And it's just with our friends in other parts of the world who have a different context and a different understanding, connected with the church in the U.S., alongside some of our more conservative friends in the Wesley Covenant and other groups. It's just been this power struggle that has not revealed the best of the church and has in many ways revealed the worst. Meanwhile, in the midst of all of this, our friends are hurting, and it is hard to be patient and wait for the door to open for the future. While we were there, we had several bishops who addressed the group, and one of the bishops, John Schull, who serves in New Jersey, talked about our system and our legislative process, and basically said our system is broken. It no longer can serve us. It has not been able to get us out of this moment. I think when the commission on the way forward was pulled together, that was an effort to step outside of the system as we've known it. And the commission came forward with something they had reached consensus about, went back into the legislative process, and didn't pass. And so some of what Davis talked about, this called General Conference in 2023, would be a restructuring, a revisioning of how we do business together as Methodists. So there is so much being talked about. And each of these plans is made up of many petitions, and they will go into legislative committee in May, and we just don't know what will come out of it. But if we are only trusting in the wisdom of our delegates, if we're only trusting in human smarts and cleverness to figure this out, nothing will happen. We have to find ways to trust the Holy Spirit and to open ourselves to the Spirit. And if you were here a couple of weeks ago, there's nothing wrong with being shrewd while we're doing that work as well. So what do we do as West End? I think we continue to celebrate the hard work that this congregation has done together in our welcome and affirmation of all people. I think we need to continue to live and love into it, finding new ways to bring and celebrate diversity in our midst. I know that there's been some reflection from some of our folks about, it feels like we're highlighting one group of people instead of celebrating all people. And I hear that and I understand that. I think when our denomination has policies and language that single out our LGBTQ friends, and our neighbors in the community see United Methodist on our sign, we need to be specific and intentional in this particular moment of the church, I believe, to say everybody's welcome. And yes, that includes you, whom our denomination right now is discriminating against. And that's my opinion, but I wanted to share at least why I feel it's important that we highlight our welcome in this moment. I think we are called to continue to love each other, to listen to one another and hear each other's stories and perspectives, and make room for all opinions and perspectives in our own congregation. As I've said, we want to care for one another and care for ourselves, recognizing that this really is a difficult and painful moment. And we're not in control, as Davis said, which is really hard for people like me. And then finally, we need to be doing what we can to prepare for action. We don't know what will come out of May's meeting. If there will be plans for new denominations, for disaffiliation, for shared ministry, we don't know what the options will be. And so we want to be doing what we can to be ready as West End to know who are we and what are we called to in the future. And as part of that discernment, and I will say we did a lot of this last fall preparing for February, and then what happened in February really was a shock, I think, to us. And we weren't prepared for that outcome. I wasn't prepared for that outcome. And I think I was dazed for a little while trying to figure out, whoa, what does this mean? And so I know it feels like, haven't we talked about this already? We have, but the conversation needs to continue as the denomination shifts and changes around us and we get more clarity and information. So we have, with the blessing of Ministry Table, called together a discernment team. And these are the names of the folks who have said yes to join with me in a season of prayer and listening and discernment. And it's a variety of folks who are longtime members and some newer members, people who represent different Sunday school classes, different constituencies in the church, different perspectives. We're a big church, and so not everybody knows everybody, so we need all of that represented in this group. We have our first meeting next Sunday afternoon, and Dr. Judy Skeen, who's a professor at Belmont University, is going to be our facilitator. She's trained in circles of trust, if you're familiar with Parker Palmer and some of his work around circles of trust. And so she will be leading us, which is a real gift for all of us and for me. And our initial goal will be to, before January 1, when some of these petitions from the traditional plan take effect, to be able to say clearly, here's where we are as West End in this moment. Here's what we believe and where we stand. And then as we move toward General Conference and as we move through General Conference, to be helping us on the path of discernment to what do we do if there's an option to disaffiliate? What do we do if a door opens for us to host weddings here or the door remains closed? So doing some of that discernment work. And these are folks, along with me and your pastors and your leaders like Davis and Amy and Alan Horner, who's our outgoing ministry chair, want to hear from you along the way. And we'll find ways to do that. So I know this has been information put to you without much time for processing questions or answers. I'm going to go ahead and start making my way to my robe. But I didn't know if anybody had questions of Davis. If you have a minute to stay around and answer questions about the plan, I will take one moment if anybody has a question specifically for me. Right. One possibility in May is that nothing gets passed. And so we have the traditional list plan as put in place January 1st. So that's something we would have to consider. I don't know how many of you are West Wing fans, but the last season when they had the election with Jimmy Smits and Alan Alda, the poor speech writer kept being told, now you need to write a speech if he wins the popular vote and loses the Electoral College. You need to have a speech if he wins the Hispanic vote and loses and he had to write like 8 speeches. And so we need to know what all our options are and to be discerning what is West End going to do. And again, if the discernment team will discern and bring to the ministry table any proposals, and the ministry table may decide we want to have a congregational gathering. So that's kind of how our process will work. There will be lots of opportunity for conversation and dialogue. So.